Thank you very much for the opportunity that I could lecture today about how to optimize exercise performance in the heat. My name is Thijs Eijsvogels and I'm affiliated to the Department of Physiology of the Radboud University Medical Center, and I'm based in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. And over the past few years, I had the opportunity to collect some data during the Norseman race together with the Norseman research team. But today I won't speak about exercise in the cold, but exercise in the heat and how you can get the best out of that. So let's start with the beginning and some principles of human thermophysiology, because humans are homeothermic species, and that means that our core body temperature is always stable. And this is very important to ensure that all processes taking place in the body are very efficient. And in our brain, there is a group of cells, and they are kind of the thermostat of the human body. And for us, that means that the temperature, the set point temperature is about 37 degrees centigrade. However, if the body temperature deviates from this 37-degree threshold, we can either activate mechanisms to cool down or to warm up and increase our metabolism. And I will tell a bit more about that in detail. So let's start with heat-losing mechanisms. So evaporation of sweat is the most important strategy to lose heat from the human body. And this is taking place if there is a sweat drop at the skin and that vaporizes into the air. And during that process, a lot of energy is being extracted from the body, and that helps you to cool down. And during exercise, this is also the main avenue to lose heat from our body. The second possibility that we have is through convection. And this is heat transfer via the movement of fluids like water or air. And you can imagine during the swimming leg, this is a very important factor, but also during the cycling when there is a lot of air velocity. And I think during the running, this is somewhere in between. A third possibility is conduction. And this is when heat transfer occurs via direct contact via different surfaces. But for a triathlete, I think this is not very important, and this can be negligible during exercise. Finally, there is also radiation, and this is electromagnetic waves that can be from the sun or can be from the body towards the environment, for example, on a very cold evening or night. And taken together, those four routes determine the total amount of heat loss that will occur from your body. On the other hand, we also have heat production possibilities. And the most important during exercise is obviously the contraction of skeletal muscles. And for this process, so the contraction of the muscle, there is energy required. But only 20% of that energy will result in finally the work delivered by the muscle. So as much as 80% of this energy is being transferred to heat. And you can imagine that this will increase your core body temperature substantially during exercise. But there is more going on, especially if you're exercising in the heat. Because if the sun is out, there is also direct radiation from the sun towards the athlete. And there is also indirect radiation, for example, diffused radiation via the clouds, but also reflect radiation through the ground surface. And there are also other factors that should be taken into account from a heat perspective. For example, the environmental temperature. If the ambient temperature is high, your core body temperature during exercise will increase more. If the sun is out, if the relative humidity is higher, it's more difficult to evaporate your sweat. And if there is less wind, there's also less convection possibilities. Also, some personal factors play a role, such as the intensity of the exercise, and directly linked to that, the magnitude of the metabolism, and personal factors like clothing, like age, like body surface area, all those factors. And taken together, they determine your final heat production. So if we have a look at our heat balance, this is what you typically see at rest. So there is a balance between heat production on one side and heat loss on the other side. And this will result in a very stable core body temperature of about 37 degrees centigrade. But during exercise, the heat production is increased substantially and could be as high as 30 to 40 times your basal resting metabolism. So there is much more heat production. And this will cause an increase in your core body temperature. And dependent on the intensity of the exercise, but also the duration of the exercise, temperatures as much as 41 degrees centigrade have been observed in athletes. And this could be problematic for two reasons. So the first reason is if you exercise in the heat, there could be an increased risk for developing heat-related illnesses. And this is a picture of the 2019 IAAF World Championship in Doha, Qatar. And many of the professional athletes competing there, like the marathon runners, but also the speed walkers, they experienced several degrees of heat-related illnesses. And I will talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. So a heat illness is not a single disease. Actually, it's a continuum. And it could be relatively mild, for example, heat exhaustion, in which you need to terminate your exercise performance. And this is probably due to, for example, dehydration. There is an increased skin blood flow to cope with the increase in your core body temperature. And hence, there is also a decrease in your cardiac output and a decrease in your blood pressure. But the heat exhaustion may also progress to heat injury. And then the athlete already experienced some physical complaints. There is some minor central nervous system dysfunction, such as a headache, there is faintness, but there could also be damage to the skeletal muscle and to some organs. So this is important to recognize early. And this is even more important when a heat injury further progresses to a heat stroke, because this is the most dangerous heat illness that can occur and can even lead to multi-organ failure and the death of an athlete. And yearly, some athletes, unfortunately, have been affected by heat stroke and die during or immediately after a race. So it's very important to recognize the complaints that are associated with a heat stroke and treat that athlete very well. And from a treatment perspective, it's very important to cool the athlete as soon as possible, preferably in an ice bath, as you can see right here in a Dutch race. So this athlete was hypothermic, has been moved to the emergency tent and is immediately drawn in a ice bath to cool down the temperature as much as possible. Because we do know if you cool down your temperature very fast, then there is 100% recovery without any complaints in the future. But if you do not, the consequences could be very deleterious. So cool first, transport second. The other important factor related to exercise and heat is not only from a health perspective, but is from a performance perspective. Because we do know that if you exercise in the heat, your exercise performance is typically reduced. And this is a picture during the Olympic Games in Beijing some time ago. And also then, especially during the marathon race, the ambient conditions were very challenging and the athletes suffered from that. So how does that work, exercise performance and performance loss in the heat? Well, this is a very nice example of a study performed in Qatar, and they had a group of athletes performing in a 43-kilometer time trial in a laboratory. And in the blue line, you can see their power output during the cool condition. But in the red line, you can see their power output in the hot condition. And as you can see, right from the start of the time trial, there is a lower exercise performance level, and you can see that the power output even reduced with more than 100 watts. So that's very substantially and represents a performance loss of more than 30%. Also, other studies explore the association between core body temperature and cycling efficiency. And here you can clearly see that if there is a rise in your core body temperature, there is a reduction in the cycling efficiency. So therefore, it's important to have a very good thermoregulation and don't increase your core body temperature too much. So having said that, exercise in the heat can increase your risk for developing heat-related illnesses, but also affects your performance as you typically perform well. So the question that you may have, what can I do about that? So let me explain this very briefly in some tips. So my first advice is to get used to the heat. So plan an acclimation or acclimatization session. And this slide very briefly summarizes the adaptations that do occur if you expose yourself to subsequent days of heat. And you can see it here. At day 0, there is no adaptation yet, but after 2 days of heat exposure, you can see, for example, that there is an increase in your sweat rate. So that means that you can produce more sweat and you also start sweating earlier. So that's very important. So you can evaporate the heat more easily and you're better in your heat balance during exercise in the heat. On the other hand, we also see that your heart rate at rest drops substantially with 20% after 7 days. And that's another benefit. We also see that your core body temperature and your skin temperature typically lower a bit if you acclimate yourself, so you get accustomed to the heat. And these processes take at least 7 days, but preferably 14 days to have the full benefits of an acclimatization session. So it's important to take this into account into your training schedule. And heat acclimation or heat acclimatization could be both naturally, doing outdoor, using a field training, and if you do it outdoor, it's defined as acclimatization. But sometimes there is no possibility to do that in the natural environment, and then you should use an artificial environment, such as a laboratory or a heat chamber, or you can heat up a chamber yourself. And if you do that, you should take that into account in your training schedule. And dependent on your traveling towards the competition, there are several possibilities on how to do that. So in the first example, you can see here that there are, from 4 weeks prior to your travel, there are several heat exposures. So you get already accustomed a little bit on how to deal with the heat. Then you travel to the site of the competition, and then you have 7 to 14 days of heat acclimation, followed by maintenance and the competition week. Alternatively, you could start back at home with your heat acclimatization or heat acclimation, have in the subsequent week some heat exposure session, travel to the site, and then have another heat acclimatization and have a maintenance week followed by the competition. This is important if you travel early. Sometimes it's not possible, and then you arrive very late to the event site. So then it's recommended to do the heat acclimation relatively short prior to competition, have another heat exposure, travel to the competition and have some maintenance over there. Or do it maximum 4 weeks before the competition, have a fully 14 days acclimation session, then have some heat exposures, travel there and have a maintenance. And this will definitely help you to improve your exercise performance in the heat. And this is a very nice example of what acclimation can do with your exercise performance. So I showed you before, this is the power output on the y-axis and the percentage distance completed on the x-axis of a 43-kilometer time trial for cyclists. And in blue is the time trial in cool environment. I showed you before, if you're non-acclimated, then your performance is reduced substantially. But after 1 week, there is already a substantial improvement in the power output derived throughout the protocol. And if you have 2 weeks of acclimation, it's almost normalized compared to exercise in a very cool environment. So humans are very well capable of adapting themselves to exercise in the heat, and this certainly will affect your performance in a positive way. My second advice is to measure or to check the heat stress levels that are on the race day take place. And for that, you should have a look to the wet bulb globe temperature. So this is an index which is calculated from 3 different thermometers. You can see on the left the globe thermometer, the black ball, and that gives you information about the radiant heat. Then the middle one is the dry bulb for the ambient temperature, and the wet bulb on the right gives you information about the humidity and airflow. And if you calculate this wet bulb globe temperature, and you can just also look this up on many weather websites, you can see the risk that is associated with a specific wet bulb globe temperature during activities and competition. Typically, for a wet bulb globe temperature below 18 degrees centigrade, it's generally safe, but I have to point out that even under those conditions, exertional heat stroke may still occur. If the temperature is above 18 degrees and between 25 degrees, there is some risk for developing heat-related illnesses. And the higher the wet bulb globe temperature is, the greater the chance for developing heat-related illnesses. And nowadays, there are also some flags at events that inform you about the level of heat stress, and which can be green, so that's a low heat stress level, moderate, high, very high, or extreme. So please have a look at that and adjust your race pace if needed to avoid any medical problems. My third advice is to apply cooling strategies, because there is very good evidence from scientific studies that if you cool yourself, this will improve your performance at the heat. Cooling could be applied at 3 different time points. It could be either prior to exercise, this is defined as pre-cooling, during exercise, defined as per-cooling, or after exercise, and then this is defined as post-cooling. Pre- and per-cooling are mainly performed to increase your exercise performance, whereas post-cooling is more important from a recovery perspective following the exercise bout. And there are different modalities to pre or per cool yourself. And a recent study that we performed, we collected and summarized all the data that is available in literature. For pre-cooling, we found 45 studies in total, representing 427 athletes. And I have to mention that all those data was collected in laboratory setting, so not in field practice. But different pre-cooling strategies were being applied, such as cold water immersion, ice water or cold water ingestion, applying cooling packs, or applying a cool vest or an ice vest. But for pre-cooling, cold water immersion was by far the most effective strategy, as this increased exercise performance in the heat with as much as 7%. For per-cooling, there were 26 studies available representing 270 athletes, and also for this type of cooling, different modalities were being used, and we found that using a cooling vest or ice vest was the most important strategy to improve your exercise performance in the heat, as this increased your exercise with as much as 12%. I do reckon, however, that those data were collected in a laboratory study, so not in field practice. So it could be that maybe cold water ingestion or ice water ingestion is much more feasible during racing conditions, as well as water spraying or water dousing during the race, as both cooling techniques increase your exercise performance with 6 and 8% respectively. I also want to stress that it's very important to practice those cooling interventions during your training regimen, because if you're not used to this, it's very difficult to apply that during a race setting. So please try this as home, and then you can benefit it during competition. My final advice is to stay hydrated. I've told you earlier that sweat evaporation is the most important avenue for losing heat at the human body. And under very hot and humid conditions, you can sweat as much as 1.5 to 2 liters per hour. So you lose a lot of fluid. And we also know that dehydration will further deteriorate your exercise performance in the heat. So make a drinking plan prior to your competition and keep up with that. And this is also something that you should practice during your training sessions. A very simple way to see whether you're hydrated or dehydrated is to check your urine. If it's relatively light, then you're well hydrated. But if it's yellowish, then there is dehydration and you should drink more. And if it's even brownish, then you're extremely dehydrated, and this will affect your performance substantially. So try to avoid being dehydrated or extremely dehydrated. This was only a very short summary about how to improve your exercise performance in the heat. But if you want to know more, or if you want to read more, I can definitely recommend you to download this protocol from the World Triathlon website, which is entitled Beat the Heat. And there is much more in-depth information and also practical assistance for you as an athlete about how to deal with the heat and how to beat the heat. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture.